Okay. Kelly, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. I'm Kelly Feehan, and I'm an extension educator for horticulture, and I'm located in Columbus. Do you want me just to dive in, or do you want?
John, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself so we know who's coming?
Hi, my name is John Fech, and I am Kelly's counterpart in the Omaha metro area, and I'll be talking about turf.
All right. Go ahead, Kelly.
Okay, I'll share my screen. Okay, are you seeing the correct?
Looks good to
Yeah.
me.
Okay, great. Well, again, hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I am going to cover landscape beds, which is mainly shrubs, perennials, and ornamental grasses. And as John said, he'll cover turf. And, you know, a lot of the information is the same for homeowners as for public. So I hope I touch on that enough and clarify it and make it different, but I'll do the best I can. But I'm going to dive in because I know both John and I have a lot of information to cover. So my tips, my basic tips, improve the soil first. I'm actually going to spend a little time on that, maybe more than Sarah expected. But the soil is the foundation. And if you want to have good, healthy plant growth and you want to have a water-wise landscape, we need to pay attention to that soil. And I know in a public landscape, it's an extra step, it's an extra maintenance, but boy, does it pay off in the long run. You know, encouraging deep, healthy roots. And a lot of that depends on the soil. So obviously we need to, if we want a water-wise landscape, we need to select those drought-tolerant plants. I'm actually not going to go into different plants because the NSA, Statewide Arboretum, has great lists. I will share some publications that Extension has where you can get some of that information as well. And grouping plants by water needs, sometimes I know in public landscapes, like in Columbus, we had a garden, a local church wanted to put in a rose garden, and they really wanted to do that in our public park. And those, not all roses are high water using, but some of them are. So, but the key is that we don't mix them up. Don't mix drought tolerant plants with plants needing higher water use. You're going to overwater one or underwater one. You know, but again, if you want a water-wise landscape, try to go with some of those native drought tolerant ones. I'll touch a little on efficient irrigation practices. I'm going to talk, this might be a little bit different, directing rainwater to plantings. I know it doesn't rain a lot, especially the last couple of years, but when we do get rain, let's make the most of it. And you know, let's slow it down and soak it in instead of watching it all run down the storm drain. And we all know that organic mulch helps to conserve soil moisture, but it also tempers, you know, soil temperatures for healthier roots, so encouraging those deeper, healthier roots. In some places, we're going more with dense planting. So we, in a public landscape, having to be replenishing that mulch is an added time factor and added maintenance. So sometimes the dense planting is shown in this picture is being used in place of that. With fertilization, I put in fertilize moderately. A lot of times with public landscapes, we don't do a lot of fertilizing, and that's okay. If you pay attention to that soil and you improve it and you select some of those native drought tolerant plants, probably don't have to do a lot of fertilizing, if any, really. The reason I mention it is because there is this belief that, you know, apply nitrogen so those plants grow fast and lush. That's healthy. But fast growth is not always healthy growth, and lush, fast-growing plants do use more water. So this, you know, a lot of times, again, that idea that we need to fertilize, especially with nitrogen, maybe you just need to pay more attention to that soil. So those are my key tips, and let me go a little bit more in depth on some of them. So improving the soil, again, remembering that's the foundation for healthy plant growth as well as being water-wise, efficient water use. So when we're reading about plants, we always read that you need a well-drained soil with good water holding capacity. And I know that always kind of sounds like an oxymoron. How can it be well-drained and hold water, or vice versa? But this is truly what we need for healthy plant growth. So we want water to be able to infiltrate. So the top picture would be one that would looks like a nice, good, friable soil with good structure. Compared to the one on the bottom that's crusted and most likely compacted underneath that. So we want to get infiltration. You know, if you improve those soils, work on that soil structure, When it does rain, when we do irrigate, the water is more likely to soak in and infiltrate rather than run off like it would here. And the other thing plant roots need, deep, healthy root systems are going to be the most efficient at using water. And we can water them the less frequently. So healthy root systems need oxygen. And so soil with good structure, you're going to get that oxygen. There's constant recharge of oxygen in the soil. Without oxygen, those plant roots just won't grow well or be healthy. Water holding capacity, again, that's the soil's ability to hold on to water so it's available to plant roots. But at the same time, excess water needs to be able to drain out. So that's that percolation, the movement down through the soil. And if you have a well-drained soil with good water holding capacity, you're hopefully going to get to this ideal soil composition. We probably never hit it 100%, but we want to get as close to it as possible. So the mineral is obviously the sand, silt, clay particles, organic matter. I'm going to talk about increasing organic matter. If you have about 5% organic matter in our landscape beds is what we aim for. Could be a little higher, but 5% is great. When I see soil tests, most of them are around 2% or less. So this is something we can do and we can focus on. But ideally, you want the pore spaces to be 25% water and 25% oxygen. And this is why we don't want to overwater. Wastewater, but it's also harmful to plant roots. Also, a good soil is going to have a high microbial population, and that's very important. So let me go on. Why that's important. So good structure. We improve soil to aim for good structure. And we always hear people talking about, do you have sand, do you have silt, do you have clay? I always say we need to change the conversation rather than what type of soil do you have, sandy or clay, to how's your structure doing? And good structure is good aggregation, and you can see that in this photo to the right, top right here. So basically, aggregates are groups of those mineral particles bound together by that microbial population, as well as earthworms and so on. So there's a lot of beneficial fungi, bacteria. They secrete glues called glomalin. Earthworms have secretions, and this is what allows these mineral particles to group together and get good aggregation. Highly dependent on organic matter, so I'm going to focus on adding organic matter. And it is organic matter, having enough water, having enough oxygen, but not too much water, that improves our biological activity in soil. So how many of you can say your public landscape soils look like this? I hope all of you. So I know a lot of you are already dealing with landscape beds that are already established, but prior to planting, if you can increase organic matter in the bed, I think that's a key thing that we can do. And I'm going to talk about a couple of landscapes I worked with here in Columbus. One that already had great soil structure, and another one where we added compost, and it just made a huge difference in my opinion. It was amazing how those plants grew and how quickly they established. I highlighted bed because some people, they're like, well, we're going to save time. We don't want to buy as much compost. So let's just add a little compost to the planting hole. Let's dig the hole, let's put in a little compost, let's plant the plant. You don't want to do that. You really want to amend the soil in the entire bed. Prior to planting, it's going to go a long way in improving that foundation and getting that soil aggregation. So by organic matter, ideally, you're going to use compost, which is already decomposed organic matter, well-rotted manure, introduce weed seeds, but it can be used. Leaf mold, different types of peat, excuse me. So, and the best way to add it is you want to get it thoroughly incorporated into that soil. So if you kind of till or spade that soil first to loosen it up, relieve compaction and so on, and then spread about a 2 to 4 inch layer of compost. So that's already decomposed organic matter. And then incorporate it for landscape beds, shrubs, perennials. You want to be amending that soil about 8 to 12 inches deep. And of course, organic matter decomposes, so it does need to be replenished on a fairly regular basis. I have to throw out here, avoid using gypsum or sand, because this is something, people will say, go to the garden center and you see the gypsum on the shelf and it helps clay soils, right? Makes them more workable, helps this water to soak in more. Well, that only works under very unique situations, and very rarely will it help a clay soil. Organic matter is going to do more for you in most cases. Another thing is, if somebody says, hey, I have a load of sand I can bring in and we can add to that bed for you to work it in. Not enough sand is going to turn clay soil to cement. So we don't recommend that either. If you're going to, it really pays off to take the time, that extra step, the extra expense to incorporate compost. And just the other day, I Googled compost in bulk plus Nebraska, and there's all kinds of places where you can get compost in bulk and they'll bring it in by the truckload and dump it for you. So an established bed, you already have an established bed. So, what do? Well, if you use organic mulch on bare soil, it'll decompose as it's supposed to. And over time, it'll slowly work its way in, freezing and thawing, and it can slowly help improve that organic matter content at a much slower rate than if you just incorporated it prior to planting. We hear leave the leaves, and that's really for pollinators. But I threw it in here because we don't have to clean up those beds. We like to keep them as clean as possible. Pick out all those leaves, rake out all those leaves. That's okay. You need to remove some, but it's okay to leave some. That's organic matter. It's going to decompose. It's going to slowly add organic matter. You can also top dress. You have to rake back that mulch and top dress with a 1/2 inch to 1 inch of compost, and then put the mulch back on top of it. Again, earthworm activity, freezing and thawing, it will slowly and gradually increase organic matter content. And the picture I have here, not a great landscape. This was a high school I worked with in Columbus, and years and years and years they had these utes. And they're like, we want to change it up. We want to do something different. So I helped them apply for a grant to the Nebraska Statewide Arboretum, a Waterwise grant. And the teacher I was working with, I said, I need to come out and check that soil because I didn't know. I knew they had wood chip mulch there, but I didn't know what was underneath it. Kids are always walking on this, the students, because it's a high school. And I went out there with my spade, and I'm not a real big person, but I pushed my foot on it and it just went all the way down. This was like a 12-inch or deeper spade, and it just soaked right in. Not soaked in, but pushed right in very easily. And I kind of went, wow, my eyes really lit up, and I'm like, whoa, this is great. And that had been years, just years and years of having that mulch. So it really had improved, it made a difference. So this was in 2015, I took this picture, we planted that fall. This is like midsummer the next year. So this is the experience I have with plant growth, how well they do. I'm so sorry about my voice. When I truly believe it was due to that soil and having compost. You might want to do something we may not do before we plant is the soil percolation test. And, we talk about doing this when we establish rain gardens and things in landscapes, but I think it should be done on any landscape bed. Just go out there, dig a hole 6 inches deep, 8 inches deep, 4 to 6 inches of ground, fill it with water. And if it's 24 hours later, you still have water in there, you're going to have some issues. And adding organic matter will help improve infiltration and percolation. But if that water disappears in a couple of hours, then it's probably too much drainage, poor water holding capacity. And again, organic matter is going to increase the ability for a sandier soil to hold on to water. So try to do those soil percolation tests, see what you have. So avoid what harms soil structure. Obviously, not attending to organic matter, trying to add to it, increase it. Excessive tillage. The pictures I have here is, that garden bed right there does not need to be tilled anymore. It's excessive tillage breaks down structure. We don't want fine powder that damages that structure. Compaction, working or walking in when wet. These are all things landscape fabrics and inorganic mulches, that inorganic mulches do not add to the organic matter. And over time, that soil, in my opinion, just gets depleted. And I know they're handy. We think they're handy to help weed control in these public landscapes, but the perennial weeds are going to grow through them. The annual weed seed's going to land on top, germinate and grow anyway. And then we can't pull them. We can't pull those weeds because they're meshed. Their roots are stuck in that mesh. So I just, as horticulturists, we understand these. We don't really like them. Buildup of salts in soil. This can come from maybe using too much manure and over fertilizing too much. And obviously overwatering will harm soil structure, and over fertilizing with nitrogen because it interferes with that those beneficial fungi and bacteria and so on that are helping with that soil aggregation. Okay, enough on soil. Although promoting a deep, healthy root system, the first thing I say is improve and maintain that soil structure. So remember that roots grow in soil pore spaces. And if you have a soil with good structure, it's going to have, micropores and macropores. Micropores to hold water, macropores for the roots to grow, and oxygen to recharge. And the pictures I have here, this is Nina Bassett from Cornell University. This was actually a construction site, and they went in and amended the soil on the right. And this was the difference in root growth between an unamended soil on the left and an amended soil on the right. So it does make a difference. Obviously, you're going to hear me say this: avoid underwatering. Plant roots you won't have a deep, healthy root system if you're not watering deep enough, and you're not watering frequently enough. I'll talk more about that in a bit. And again, overwatering, I can't say it enough. It happens a lot more than we realize. Maybe not as much in public landscapes because they're limited. But if you have irrigation to that public landscape, make sure you're not overwatering. So deep and infrequent. Deep means, moisten to the depth of the roots. If you moisten, if you're adding more water and you're moistening deeper than the roots are probably genetically going to grow, you're wasting water. So for perennials, as a rule, we'll say moisten that soil about 8 to 10 inches deep. For trees and shrubs, about 12 to 18 inches deep. How do you know? John's going to talk about this a little more, but a good long screwdriver and push it in and gives you a pretty good sense of how deep you're watering, or obviously a soil probe as well. Infrequent, what do we mean by infrequent? People always want me to tell them, should I water twice a week, once a week? And I always tell them, I can't tell you that because I don't know what your soil is. I don't know how much shade you have, the wind exposure, etc. So every site's a little different. There's some general rules of thumb, but every site's a little different. So by infrequent, we just mean, when the plants show signs of needing water, or the soil is starting to dry out, which you can determine again with that screwdriver test and that soil probe. Avoid excess nitrogen. Again, you're going to hear some repeats here, but it's some basic information. And I just know people got to fertilize and help those plants to grow really fast, whether it's in a public landscape or in a home landscape. But nitrogen fertilizer, you get top growth at the expense of roots. Some of those fast release nitrogens, they can burn those tiny little root hairs as those roots are trying to establish. And it's those tiny root hairs that are responsible for absorbing most of the water in the soil. So we want to do what's healthy. Right plant, right place. This is those drought tolerant plants. And I know you know that. I'm not going to go into selection at all, except to tell you, make sure those are drought tolerant plants. Listen to the Nebraska Statewide Arboretum, help you select plants. Look at those lists. I'm not a firm believer that we can only plant natives, but a lot of our natives have the deeper root systems naturally. And that's what allows a plant to be more drought tolerant or avoid drought. So these are my common example pictures I use. This is a health strip. This is oyster grass that's not irrigated. So this is on the west side of a house. And these are, all plants, the blaze little blue stem and tall sedum and I think there was some moss rose in here. Again, I know this is a home site, but this site, I know that this site is rarely watered. The last couple of years, it was probably watered because of the drought, but once established, these plants do just fine with very little irrigation. Zoning, this is a public landscape in Columbus, and in this bed, they're like, wow, this is surrounded by pavement. It's hot. We got to put in some natives. So they went with Leatris, and I believe it was, I'm pretty sure this is Husker Red Penstemon. I can't remember what this was. This is August. It looks pretty bad, doesn't it? And that's because it's getting irrigated by this over irrigated Kentucky bluegrass that looks this green and lush in August in this location. So don't water landscape beds with your lawn irrigation system. It'll be too much water, even if you reduce it, as John's going to suggest. And just don't mix plants with different water needs. I said I'd mention, this is our Chamber of Landscape. That's another one where I talked them into bringing in, you know, a truckload of compost, spreading it out and amending it. We've had great luck in this health strip. But I just wanted to mention a couple of neb guides here for ideas for plants. Perennials and Waterwise landscapes, and then this landscape water conservation neb guide. We have lists of some trees and shrubs and forests. And those can be found at extensionpubs.unl.edu. Another source of information on plants to select. Plant replacement. Okay, so you have some plants, you have a public landscape or a home landscape, and you've got some plants in there that seem to need more water, or you've read that they need more water. So let's pull them out and replace them with drought tolerant plants. Maybe not. Remember that new plants, even drought tolerant plants, require regular irrigation for their first 1 to 3 years. And what makes them drought tolerant is that deep, healthy root system, extensive root system that's spread out. And it can take 1 to 3 years for a plant to get there. So you might need to increase irrigation. The other thing is that field research indicates most established landscape plants will perform fine with 20 to 40% less irrigation. So yeah, hopefully you've got your plants established in your public landscapes, and if you're worried that you're not watering enough, you're probably watering just fine. What is efficient irrigation? Again, here's some repetition, deep and infrequent. So moisten the soil. When you do water, moisten the soil to the root depth, 8 to 12 inches. Shallow irrigation leads to shallow roots. The top of that's those top 3, 4, 5 inches dry out quicker, and you need to water more frequently or the plants are stressed. Let's get that that root system established. If it's a heavier clay soil, you might have to irrigate a couple of days, in a row to actually moisten it that deep. And then obviously you're going to go a lot longer on the clay soil before you have to water again. Avoid overspray. Pavement doesn't grow. It's a waste of water. Avoid runoff. So irrigating at too fast of a rate, so the water's running off. Again, that early, you've all heard this, the early when there's less wind, less heat for evaporation, typically 4 a.m. to 10 a.m. Yes, evening is the same, but if you water in the evening, you could promote diseases. Look into using drip irrigation, soaker hoses. They are definitely efficient because you don't have the water spray being lost. They're more expensive, and they have to be maintained. They have to be tended to, but they are definitely lower water using. Hydrozones, I've already talked about that. Rainwater harvesting, that's a little different. I'm getting down to about my last slides, John. So make the most of rainfall when it falls. A lot of people will say it doesn't rain, so why should we worry? And I'm like, well, when it does rain, let's make the most of it. And a lot of this has come about because of stormwater management, trying to reduce runoff from our urban communities, and that's for water quality, and that's very critical as well. But I also look at it as a way to capture some of that rainwater and in water conservation. So whenever possible, can you locate your beds where they'll capture rainfall from an upslope, from a downspout? Can you find a way to direct rainfall into that landscape bed? So, the most direct route is just directing a downspout to it. This is our chamber office. We actually cut out part of the pavement. We have a grate there, and then we built up a little berm over here by the sidewalk, so the water wouldn't just shoot across and into the street, created a little bioswale. And we did put a rain garden in down here. It's not in yet, but that's a great way to capture some of that rainwater and soak it in rather than all of it going down the storm drain. Berm's a very low berm kind of place to, where the water from the downspout will come out and hit that and kind of spread out and soak in. This is Dave Dykey from Ohio State University invented this term. Where you plant your low berms, you don't want real high berms because they dry out quickly. But the lower berms, planted, along the contour of a slope. So as the water runs down, it can capture it, slow it down, soak it in. When you're designing your public landscapes or your public beds, think about this. Rain barrels and rain gardens are another example. I'm going to just skip on. Correct mulching and dense planting. I don't need to really say more. Just the key here is you don't want it to be too deep. Too much of a good thing is a bad thing. So emphasize, we hear complaints about adding mulch and having mulch, but most people put way too much on. So it should only be in a landscape bed a couple of inches deep and not up against the stems. Sarah, this is my last slide. Sarah asked me to talk a little bit about weed control. So key, control before planting. If you have a lot of perennials in that area where you're going to plant, tilling is only going to stir up weed seed, maybe vegetatively propagate some of those roots. So, if you have some problem weeds, you might need to go out there and round up that area ahead of time. You don't want to use Roundup. There are soil sterilization practices. Again, this area usually has to be bare for a year to do that for at least one season. Careful of manure or soil amendments. If somebody wants to offer it, weed seeds, hay and straw, weed seeds. Nothing beats regular hand weeding. And I know that's an issue with public landscapes and getting those volunteers. They're always gung-ho and at least for a year or two. But nothing beats regular hand weeding of small weeds to get them before they go to seed. Mulching, dense planting, drip irrigation and soaker hoses, micro irrigation. So you're putting the water near the plant roots and you're not watering those weed seeds. Not a lot of herbicides. It's tough. Herbicide control in our landscape beds is tough. Simply because a lot of them are there to kill broadleaf weeds, and all of our shrubs and perennial flowers are broadleaf. So, but there are these are the pre-emergent products that are labeled for use in landscape beds, shrubs, flowers. And so there are some products, and I can share this PowerPoint with Sarah to share with you later. Broadleaf weeds are probably our best thing is still to spot treat those with glyphosate or Roundup. There are some applicators. This buckthorn blaster is, it's an applicator. It's not to store the pesticide. That would be illegal. But you put the Roundup in there, and then you can actually, it looks like a glue stick, and just put it on the leaves. Pretty safe. Weedy grasses are a major issue, and there are that orthograspigon, the fertilome over the top. They will control some of those weedy grasses without harming your perennials. And yellow nut sedge is a tough one. If you have shrubs, you can spot treat with sedge hammer. Okay, if you have perennial flowers, there's not much you can do. So I'm going to stop there to give John enough time. Unless you want me to answer some questions right now.
Well, we could just before we move on, sometimes it's nice to just check if we had any questions folks wanted to ask. But Kelly's not going anywhere, so we can take questions after John's segment too.
I'm fine with that.
Okay, so if you want to unshare, then we'll let John go ahead.
I thought I had, but I guess I didn't. There
Okay.
we go.
All right, you want me just to share now?
Yep, go for it. And I think that if Kelly turns her video off and you turn yours on, then that'll show up on the recording.
I may have to unshare to do that. Oh, no, here, I can do it.
Okay.
Here we go.
All right.
And let me hit this right here. There we go. Okay, so I was recently watching the remake of The Parent Trap, which has a famous line in it that goes, "Hey Meredith, do you want the 411 on my dad's dating life?" And that's where Lindsay Lohan asked Meredith Blake if she would do that, and it kind of became the 411 as just kind of stuck in my brain. So efficient turf watering. So that's kind of why we titled it this way. There are a lot of similarities.
John, sorry, we still see, we're not seeing the actual presentation mode. I don't know if you shared the right screen.
Okay. Are you seeing anything?
Yeah, we're seeing your PowerPoint, but it's not in presentation mode.
Okay.
So we're seeing your little slides on the sides and so on. I know when I do that, it's because I share the wrong screen.
Okay. Well, should I stop sharing? I will stop sharing and we'll see what we come up with.
I think if you want to hit share again, it might have just been an internet thing because you had the spinning wheel of death.
Okay. Did it get any better, or are you still?
Now we just see you. I'm not sure you fully shared.
Okay. Well, let's see here. How about if we start here? Is that any better?
Nothing happened yet.
Okay.
We still just see you. Not that that's bad. We're happy to see you.
We don't want that. Okay, let me go back over here and try again. Sometimes when I do it too fast.
It could be. I'm not sure. There we go. Let it. So maybe start your presentation now.
Okay.
There we go. Oh, we saw it for just a second.
So what are you seeing now?
I see your working PowerPoint, like where you can edit it.
Well, shoot.
You know, there's nothing wrong with this. We can see the information.
Okay. No.
But I do appreciate the Honey I Shrunk. Did you? No, that's not the movie you mentioned. Which movie did you mention? I was thinking of Honey I Shrunk the Kids because of their interaction with the sprinkler system.
No, but that's another good reference. Well, in lieu of time, until I don't know if I can get this figured out, let's plunge forward, and you'll have to see a slightly smaller image, which I don't think will be a problem. So these are my considerations, is deciding when turf does and doesn't need water, and of course, how much water should be applied. Slopes add a unique twist to it. And there are a couple of bottom lines that are important. Obviously, applying water evenly is something that is really important, and almost nobody does. Seasonal adjustments are important. And then finally, languishing turf is a problem. So we'll move along. On the left is not the approved method for
I'm really sorry, John. Just make sure you scroll down through your slides because we're just still seeing your title slide.
Okay.
Sorry to keep interrupting you.
No, I'm glad you did. Let's try this. Did you get the second slide now?
No.
All right. Maybe you could take Kelly's questions now while I run and get my IT person.
For sure. So we did get a question from Annette, and this might be maybe both for you, Kelly and John. But she says she's having difficulty maintaining grass boulevards due to weeds, getting it to grow well, damage from the snow plows. Do you have recommendations of other grass or plants to grow that could handle the heavy foot traffic? She's thought about clover, but it's out of stock everywhere and she can't get a hold of it.
So is this a yeah,
I
turf
think
grass
this,
that you're trying to grow or ornamental grasses?
yeah, Annette, do you want to chime in here? Or you can always just message me back too. Currently turf.
Turf, yeah, I mean,
It sounds like she's considering ditching the turf and going for a different option.
they all have maintenance. And I have some coworkers on here,
screen?
Elizabeth and
This
Nicole, so feel free to pipe in too.
Okay.
You know, that's just a tough situation. And same with Justin and Sarah, if you have any suggestions, because you work with a lot of these sites. Oh, hey, John, you got it. You know what, I guess I'm struggling because, yeah, boy, that's just a tough site. And, you know, there are some, especially with the snow plows, and I don't know if the snow plow putting salt issues on there. I mean, you're not going to get away from that. I think most of our turf grasses and ornamental grasses are going to have a problem with that. Yeah, I mean, definitely there's some low growing native things that you could maybe try. I don't want to get into them right now.
I'll chime in that and say, I think the thing you might have to consider is that foot traffic. There's reason we like turf grass is because it handles all of our foot traffic. And there's lots of native plants we can go for, like salt tolerant things, or you know, stuff that can handle being near the snow plows and the chemical they put on the road. But then we might have to make the choice to just have a couple pathways to walk on and not necessarily be able to walk in that whole space. That's kind of my take. I don't know if that answers your question, or maybe gives you some ideas of things to think about. But that's the tough thing, is that the reason turf is so valuable is because we can walk all over it. All right, good. I'm glad we got you some ideas. John, we see a giant slide saying considerations.
All right, so we're back, and thank you, not to me, but thank you to our IT fellow, Tom, who diagnosed that I had not clicked on the right screen share, that I needed to click on screen 2. And I didn't know that, so hopefully that'll be good going forward. So you see a fellow on the left with method 1 in the screen now?
That is what I see.
Okay, so that's wrong. You can't tell from above. You got the turf is in the way. You need to look at the reaction of the turf to any kind of stress or water extraction. And that is indicated in method 2 by the footprinting that is left after walking across it and coming back a couple hours later and still seeing your footprint. So the method 2 is a viable option. Method 1 is not. A couple more options would be knowing through the soil probe mentioned by Kelly. That's a really good one. And also that soil probe gives you an idea of what else is in the soil profile, whether it be where turf was planted across the top of sand or just crummy soil, builder debris, whatever might be there. But the screwdriver is also a good way. And what we're indicating here in the screwdriver test is moist soil is clinging to the blade or the shaft of the screwdriver, and it's not powdery dry and it's not soggy with water dripping off the top of it. Also, just the force required that it takes to push the screwdriver in the ground. If it's hard to push in the ground, then the soil is probably pretty dry. If it slices through like hot butter, it's probably overly wet. Now, the question then is how much water should be applied? We get that question all the time, but really you need to reframe that and think about it as, well, how much water? Is that the right question? Or is there, how long should the sprinkler system run? And what are the factors that lead to that? Well, there's 6, and they all start with S. So it's the 6 S's. The soil type, the slope, the sun and shade, the season of the year, the species, and finally separating turf and ornamentals. so really it's what happens when it runs too short and too long. And on the left, we have it running too long. And on the right, we have that footprinting again, and also kind of a bluish cast to quite a bit of the turf in this landscape, where it is running too short, not long enough. So of those 6 S factors, the first one is the soils. Kelly talked a lot about soils, which is really important, but they have a different capacity to absorb irrigation water. Clay, loam, and sand. Sand absorbs it very quickly and very well, and it tends to kind of go straight up and down vertically. Clay very slowly, and it spreads out laterally. And so it absorbs it slowly, but hangs on to it for a long time. And just the opposite is sand. And also the age of the soil. As I age, I think more and more about the soil type and its age. If you look at the top 2 photos, we're looking at relatively young landscapes, very young landscape in this public landscape in the upper left, brand new, where the existing older soil has been stripped off, and now we're really just dealing with new soil, and it's all clay because it has been excavated, and we're starting over with soil that used to be 12 inches or 12 feet deep. So it's new. The upper right landscape on this college campus is relatively new, probably, 8-10 years old. So it's just sort of coming into its own, as opposed to the lower 2 landscapes, which are older. And all of that debris, that landscape debris that has been falling on the turf, being chewed up with mowers, working its way slowly downward, has made a big impact on the health of the turf. And it's really important. It's hard to overstate the type, but also the age and how recently was that turf disturbed. That's going to make a big impact on how well it performs. The soil compaction then is related heavily to whether it's a clay soil with soil particles that are easily pressed together, or is it a soil like Kelly was showing with lots of humus in it that naturally resists compaction. So the soil type is a big thing, and 1B there would be soil age. Slope is the second factor. Slope in this public landscape creates a huge factor when it comes to water retention, water infiltration, and then also water infiltration or percolation downward. So slope really sort of exacerbates or worsens the problem that we come across. There are some strategies for dealing with sloped turf. The 3 that really come to mind are using delayed starts, and that really comes from the starts with the either doing it yourself by turning the nozzle, letting it run a short amount of time, maybe 10 minutes, and then turning it off and letting it soak in, or doing the same thing with the irrigation controller if you're dealing with that kind of thing in a public landscape. Aeration is greatly beneficial for greater infiltration and letting that water soak in. And then, of course, application uniformity is big, so you don't have twice as much on one side versus half as much on the other side. So that makes a big difference on sloped turf. Here's an illustration of what you see in aeration. The part of the turf on the right has been recently aerated. The part on the left has not. And you can see just even 30 minutes after application, almost all of the irrigation water is soaked in on the right and very little on the left. The third factor is sun and shade. The 2 illustrations on the top are older campus locations that are heavily shaded. When you're dealing with shaded sites, they don't have quite the draw for water. They don't have quite the evapotranspiration or the pull from the sky that sunny sites do, like you see below in this wide open landscape on the left and relatively a full sun location on the right. So they make a big difference when it comes to that. So sun and shade, I guess, again, there's two S's within the third S. I should have titled this third S 1 and B, but you get the idea. Sun and shade being quite important in the water use. Right in the middle of the 6 S's, we're going to introduce the 2 bottom lines. And first of all, that is to keep the soil and roots moist, not soggy or not dry. The key there is moist. The extremes of soggy and dry are bad bottom lines. And the second one, as Kelly was indicating, watering to the bottom of the root system. And there are 2 ways to figure that out. The first is really easy, use a screwdriver. And the second one is more difficult to determine and implement, particularly because turf has an annual root system, unlike our perennials. So what we have to depend on is the historical averages throughout the year. We also have to think about how much fertilizer has been applied, especially nitrogen and phosphorus, because they will greatly influence rooting depth, both recently and deeper and shallower. And thirdly, dig and look. These are important factors. The seasonal influence and historical averages really will help us in terms of how often, how much, how long. And in the spring, when the roots are deeper, especially with our cool season turfs, it's like Kelly was describing, deep and infrequent watering. When in the middle of the summer, due to the higher soil temperatures, cool season turfs will retract and the depth of the roots will be shortened. So then you actually need to shift to light and frequent irrigation instead of deep and infrequent. We're matching the depth of the root system with the infiltration or the percolation of the water. And then as the season progresses and the soil temperatures cool down, we shift back to deep and infrequent again. And you may be thinking, okay, that's interesting, but what's that based on? Is that just some fuzzy notion? No, it's based on historical averages throughout the year. The Rhizotron is a research tool that is utilized to measure the depth of the roots throughout the year. We used to have an active Rhizotron at our research facility near Meade, but this is an illustration of one that's at the University of Georgia. And so what it does is through these soil observation chambers in the root system, you can see roots and measure their depth and their how fibrous they are and how extensive they are and all those kinds of things. So it's very helpful in establishing a historical average. The fertility level, like I mentioned, is great in terms of knowing how deep the roots are going to go. Reduced roots on low fertility and reduced roots on high fertility. We want kind of that sweet spot in the middle, as opposed to too little on the left and too much on the right. And then finally, dig and look when you're looking for how deep are the roots. And this is something that, probably fits all of us as horticulturists and gardeners, is to simply dig and look. And that's going to help you determine how deep the roots are. So those 3 things together make an important difference. There's a big need in order to water evenly, to apply water evenly. And here are 2 public spaces that are not doing that, and big areas of uneven water application in terms of the in-ground irrigation systems, low pressure, clogged heads, a number of other reasons. In this case, leaking valves and broken pop-up spray heads. So the key there is to watch it run and watch it run frequently. Don't rely on just it happening automatically. It's not something that will be free from any kind of breakage. In fact, irrigation systems do break frequently and need to be repaired when they do. If you are letting it run with problems, it's going to be what we call irrigation for the dry spots. And I wish I had coined this phrase. I'm borrowing from Gerald Horst, who was a turf professor at the university about 10 years ago. But he had this great phrase, irrigation for the dry spots, which means human nature. We are tending individuals and tending people. We tend for pets, we tend for little children, and we tend for plants. we like to tend them. And so the way to tend for a lawn is let the irrigation system run until it's completely green. But as you can see in this illustration, they're applying so much water that it's bleaching out the fence, and it's causing dead turf at the bottom of the fence because so much water is being applied. Now to the right, there's a lot of green turf, but we're hugely overwatering the turf on the right. So we want to avoid that. Another step is timing, and that helps a lot with application uniformity, particularly in terms of reduced evapotranspiration or pull from the sky. And also in the morning hours, we tend to have less wind and movement off site. So 5 to 10 a.m. is a good time, especially from a timing standpoint. An irrigation audit is something I would recommend for any irrigation system, regardless of whether it's a week old or a year old or 10 years old, because they're all broken. They all have flaws. Regardless of what happens. You could have the right out of the box issue where whether it's a new starter being installed in your car, those have flaws right out of the box, and so do irrigation systems. Irrigation heads, valve controller boxes, they all have flaws right out of the box. So it's pretty simple, but it is a multi-step procedure. You turn it on and watch it run, and you will probably see an irrigation head being applied to a mailbox so strong that it's causing it to lean over to the right-hand side. But then you fix those obvious flaws, and you fix the biggest flaws first, the ones that seem to have the greatest impact. And then the next step is to remeasure that output. And you just use some simple measuring devices. You can buy some really sophisticated really cool irrigation devices, or you can just use simple ones like tuna cans and cat food cans, and replace the parts, make adjustments, and then remeasure. You can also do, we have number 7 here. We do have an expanded version of this on the website go.unl.edu/waterdogs. But you can also do a little bit of trimming. As Kelly said, quite often we irrigate too long or too much. So for example, instead of letting an irrigation zone run 30 minutes, just trim it back 10% to 27 minutes. You're probably not going to notice much of a difference in terms of quality, and it's an easy 10% savings. So it's a thing to consider, especially after you do the irrigation audit. And then the 5th S is to make changes during the growing season. This is best done by turning the system off and running each zone according to its unique needs, and then making weekly adjustments in the runtime. For Kentucky bluegrass, on average, this time of year, we're going to want 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch in April, May, in the absence of natural rainfall, and then bumping that up to 1 inch or so in June, 1.5 inches in July and August when it doesn't rain and we have a lot of evapotranspiration or pull from the sky, and then backing it down in the fall. Tall fescue is different. It's going to require, on average, about 1/2 of that amount of water because it has a very deep root system, as Kelly was talking about with promoting a deep root system. The last S is to separate turf and ornamentals. We don't want them growing together like the illustration on the right, because you'll probably be overwatering the trees and underwatering the turf. In this situation, dare say that they're overwatering the trees because the turf is nice and green. On the left, you see a great public space with a great illustration in the implementation of separation of turf and ornamentals. So as best you can, try to make big landscape beds and big turf beds. Think of turf as a planned, dedicated, thought of in advanced section of the landscape, a bubble, a blob that is well-defined and separated from the ornamentals. The last piece here is what to do for languishing turf. And the first thing I would recommend is an irrigation audit. And we can share more information on that in future programs, or you can just go to the water website, their Water Dogs website, and that could help you a lot determining where water is landing and where it's not. Think of the bottom 2 lines of keeping the soil moist, not soggy and not dry, and then watering to the bottom of the root system. Counting the number of hours per sun per day. Quite often, it's hard to know that, and you kind of have to figure that out at, 7 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 4 o'clock, various times of the day. And of course, you probably all heard many, many times, right plant, right place. Then the fourth thing, identify and fix possible disease and insect problems. Quite often, turf is languishing as a result of that. And also from abiotic maladies like slope and compaction and buried builder debris. The final thing there is to aerate or power rake extensively and renovate. Consider switching turfgrass species, and that can make a big difference in terms of languishing turf. So that's my last slide. That's what I have to share. Thanks to Tom, who was able to help it go. And I think I will stop sharing now. Back to the original, what do you call it? Kind of like Hollywood Squares or the Brady Bunch, where you had all the different squares in front of you. So hopefully we're back to the grid view.
We're back.
Okay.
Give us. So thank you, John. That was wonderful. Thank you for everybody for taking the time to let us work the technology out. It's always wonderful when it works, but it's nerve-wracking when it doesn't, and you have all of these people waiting. So we talked about Annette's question about what to do along the road. Kelly, I know you answered this in the chat, but just to share with anybody who may not be able to read the chat, John asked about ways to jumpstart healthy microbial communities in the soil. He's wondering, I think, if there's a magic elixir. Do you have that?
Yeah, well, we have tons of native, wonderful microbial populations already. So the thing is to provide them with what they need to thrive. And that's organic matter in our soil, which is their food source. It's an aerobic environment. So, not having compaction, not overwatering. We also know that excess nitrogen can have a negative effect on some of our microbial population. So they're there, and adding, sometimes they have commercial things you can buy to add, but they really just adding some compost will add a lot of them, or even bringing in some topsoil from the area that's decent topsoil that probably, will already have some. And then if you give them what they need to grow and thrive, they will.
And probably leaving stuff alone too. I really liked what John said about how we like to tend our plants. And there's nothing that's tougher as a gardener than to have all these beautiful plants that don't need you. And I think about that with soil, with microbial activity in soil, that leaf debris that falls underneath of our plants. If we can leave that, it's tough because that's what we have to do at this time of year when we all want to be out in our gardens. But that's where I see the most, if I dig in my leaf debris, I can see mycorrhizal growth. I can see different things happening. And if I can make myself leave that, I know more will happen.
Yeah, and from a turf standpoint, you just need a little more help. You have a closed system, more or less. You don't have the option to pull plants out as well. So aeration and, triple aeration, one pass across the top is not adequate. Triple aeration, the kind that pull plugs out. And then if you want to introduce organic matter, that's a good step. It can be a little clunky because it's hard to get it out evenly, but very light applications can work pretty well. And then drag a piece of chain link fence around to kind of move things in as best you can. That can make a big difference. But as Kelly said, starting off from right beginning, I have a big frustration with home builders who want to dig out the foundation and then spread out the crummy soil that's basically bedrock, and then do the finished grade and move on to the next house. If new homeowners would just spend as much money on putting a little bit of compost across this area, even half the amount of money they spend on draperies and new carpeting, they would be so much better off for the next 40 years. but they just won't do it. So if you have any friends, to all the listeners here, if you have any friends who are building a new house, beg them and plead with them to try to improve the soil before putting in any plants right at the time of the finished grade. They will thank you forever. They'll buy you lattes for the rest of your life.
Yeah, I would, especially with that turf, because it's not like we can
Yep.
just rake back some mulch and put something down.
Exactly.
Kelly, you made a comment about sometimes maybe excess nitrogen can be tough on the microbes. So maybe that comes back to how we fertilize our turf. If we're struggling to get that activity under turf and we're also putting down fertilizer, we might kind of be working against ourselves. Would you say that's true, John?
Absolutely. And in fact, we just came out with a brand new turf grass calendar. Sarah Browning and I and our new horticulture educator on campus and Rock Guswa wrote this brand new turf grass calendar that makes a distinction between new lawns and older lawns. Because the newer lawns have very little organic matter and need a little bit more fertilizer, and the older lawns have greater organic matter and need less fertilizer. And so you can just go to I'll share that with you, Sarah.
Please do. I think I need that.
Yeah, it's a brand new one, and we focused a lot on that and also making adjustments. Most of the time, the fertilizer bag calls for more fertilizer than the turf needs, even on new lawns. So it talks about how to make those adjustments downward, and then putting on, moderate amounts, low to moderate amounts of fertilizer, as opposed to high amounts of fertilizer in the typical 4-step program that you see at the hardware store.
That would be great. I think I know I would benefit from that. I know very little about turf care, and I would just follow what the bag said.
That's okay. I know very little about hydrangea care, so it all works.
We're even. Okay.
Yeah.
Justin had a question for you about what turf species would you recommend for lower maintenance public spaces like parks and schools?
Yeah, so for parks and schools, I'd be looking at buffalo grass and the older types of tall fescue. Like Kelly said, buffalo grass is a high maintenance turf in the first year, or at least medium maintenance. It's going to take regular watering and some herbicides in order to get it established. Once it's established, it sort of magically flips into a ultra low maintenance turf. So if you can, if you can provide some initial watering and fertilization and weed control in year one, it will pay off big dividends down the road. The older types of tall fescues are more inexpensive than the newer types, but where premium quality and fine texture are not required, they work great, and they're only half the price. But where you want a more traditional, finer textured lawn or finer textured public space, like in a mall setting or something like that, the turf type tall fescues work great. They still have a relatively deep root system. But if it's a lower maintenance public space, I'd go with the older types of tall fescue because they're going to be less expensive and still have a big deep root system to draw water and nutrients out of the soil.
That's great. Yeah, that's a tough setting because it's low maintenance, but it's very high traffic.
Yes.
If you think about a schoolyard. So
yeah, and where the tall fescue is going to have better wear tolerance and traffic tolerance than the buffalo grass. Buffalo grass is not going to have great wear tolerance. So if it's just something to be green, then you probably might want to lean more towards the buffalo grass. If it's more, like a cemetery, or if it's going to be something where there's going to be a lot of traffic and wear, then you lean more towards the tall fescue.
That makes sense. All right. Yes, Justin says that was great. All right. Well, those are some great questions. Thank you both for those presentations. I got a lot out of both of them. I didn't think to mention soil in my email, Kelly, but I should have, and luckily I didn't have to because you were on top of it. But we've got this whole webinar recorded, and we'll send it out to the registration list, and then yeah, if you want to send me that calendar, I'll include that as well.
You bet.
Yeah. Oh, Bruce Hoffman would like to add that Sundancer buffalo seed is heads and shoulders above the rest of them. So that's throwing it down, Bruce.
Yeah, good comment, Bruce. Sundancer is a new release, relatively new, from the University of Nebraska Buffalo Grass Breeding Program. There are a couple others. Prestige is pretty good. And there's another one, I don't remember, but there are 3 or 4 that have been developed in Nebraska and selected. Keenan Edmondson is the lead researcher in that, and he's literally looking at what, Kelly? We looked at those here a while back, thousands of new selections and clones from all over across the country, looking for all of these different factors. But I do like Sundancer. I like that a lot.
All right. Okay, thank you, everyone. And if you have questions later, I can always connect you to Kelly or John. I'm sure that they would be happy to answer, or maybe we have something in their materials that can answer more questions. So enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thanks, Kelly.